Great. Well, thanks for having me again. Yesterday, with a few of you was just really enlivening, even for me. The time flew and nothing about it felt laborious. We talked a lot about stories, so I'm excited to keep talking about stories with you today in this moment. Just the other day, I was talking to a friend who was considering going to divinity school. I think about my experience in divinity school as a pretty pivotal moment in my life. And I was talking to him about this, and I noticed how quickly I go into the library of stories I tell about myself and my life over and over. You know, these stories about Hurricane Katrina, or even why I went to divinity school, or how parenting's going. I was present with my friend, but I also couldn't help notice how rehearsed certain stories were. Also being present with my friend, I noticed how this noticing quickly turned into a barrage of other questions. How did these versions of these stories even get here? When did they get created? Was it during the thing or after the thing? What other versions of this story am I not telling? I wonder how I can repeat them with such ease, and how my actions may even reinforce these stories, even when I'm not thinking about them. And then, of course, as a person, I'm living in a culture. I can name stories about other parts of my life, growing up in the Southern Baptist Church, that I can just, like the poem, they're just in my pinky toe, and I can't get them out. Those 10 verses are just stuck. I have this canon of stories about being from New Orleans and my grandmother, about Hurricane Betsy and about Ida and the Mardi Gras after Katrina. There's this whole library from my family, from my grandparents, about my aunts, from my mom, just as big of a library as there is at Cambridge. Cultures have canons of stories. It's how they become cultures in the first place. And all of our stories really matter because they do ultimately shape a large part of our reality. Maybe you haven't noticed, but our reality in this moment is shifting at almost every level in our communities. Our realities within ourselves, our realities that give shape to our place in the family of things, like Mary Oliver says, is shifting. But my question for us this morning is whether or not we have the stories to match. We have stories that tell us where we've been, but do we have the stories that point us in the direction of who we're becoming? To help us imagine where we're going. So let's dig a little bit into why humans tell stories. There's a couple of different reasons, but I think they have really important functions for us. Part of why we tell stories is to order the world around us. They let us know which is which and which is that and which is the other and which is us. Let's take a look at creation stories. There's some really wonky creation stories out there. And I won't read them because I don't know if they're yours. But at the very least, many of us probably grew up with the creation story in Genesis. So we'll start there. And it has ordered our world, whether we like it or not. It impacts how we think about our roles as humans, thinking about creation care, or how we think of our relationship to non-humans, to the land, to gender. We tell stories that order the world because it helps us make meaning of the people, things, and places around us. And unfortunately, friends, that need doesn't really go away with more degrees or rational thought, unfortunately. What origin stories in this moment are we telling about ourselves? How did we get here? And what origin stories are we telling about ourselves that help us get to the next place? Perhaps we need new origin stories, or maybe to tell the truth in the first place. The second reason we tell stories is for connection. to feel close to another person, to get those mirror neurons working. I like when people eat on Zoom, for example, because it's like, oh, I too have a body. And maybe I haven't eaten since yesterday. Those are mirror neurons making my saliva glands work and thinking, I should go grab a snack. Oftentimes, when someone shares a story about what made them smile or feel an emotion, if we're really present with them, we really can't help but to be connected, to perhaps know someone else a little more than we did just seconds before. We need these stories of connection to feel human. Sometimes we need these stories not to feel numb or overwhelmed or lost in the tragedy of it all. And then the other reason we tell stories is to shape and affirm our ego. These are stories that I tell that give myself insight to how I want to be perceived by others. They may often be stories where, as the young people call it, they have main character syndrome. In child development, the ego is really not the devil. And also, we live in a culture that over-congratulates and props up individual egos over many, 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 many other things. Stories about egos can look all different types of ways. And some of the common plots in fairy tales often have the same arc of the same energy as the stories we tell about the ego. We're in a UU church, so I think it's safe to say some of us have read Women Who Run with the Wolves. Yeah, that's part of, if anything, that's part of our canon. And she goes into some stories, some categories of stories like the rags to riches. We see Cinderella or Prince and the Pauper, where some poor protagonist acquires resources, money, and wealth, beauty. This incredible magical partner loses it all. Ugh, what a guy. And gains it all back. We can tell the story from the place of our ego that we have grown as a result of losing it all and working to pull ourselves up from our bootstraps to get it back. Some of us may wish that was the story we could tell about this moment. Another example of an ego plot archetype is the plot of tragedy, wherein the main character is a hero with a major flaw that's ultimately responsible for their downfall. Their misfortune evokes pity and sympathy, kind of like stories like Romeo and Juliet or Bonnie and Clyde fall into this category. We use these stories to shape and firm our ego based on how we desire to be perceived in the world. Do you have any stories that you tell that you use maybe to evoke sympathy, empathy, thin line? There is nothing wrong with those stories. It's just about noticing how we see ourselves and our wounds. It points us towards what needs attention and love a little deeper. So we tell stories to order our worlds, to find connection, and to shape the perception of ourselves to others. Sometimes we tell stories to do all three. But there is a last reason we tell stories, because we want somebody to do something. We want to share a message about a community or an idea. We use stories to let them know that they belong to a place, to a community, to a group. Hopefully you all are inviting your friends to church. And you're using stories to tell them about what amazing and wonderful things happen in this building. I hear there's a stewardship campaign on the way. Hopefully there's a magnitude of stories of how this place has transformed lives. And other times at our not so best moments, perhaps we've used stories to evoke shame and guilt, to compel people to do something, tapping into what our ego needs to feel like we're good people. All of these reasons inform why and how we tell the stories that we tell. I hope by this point you're getting the idea that stories aren't necessarily objective or based in some historical fact that would be easy to prove in some archive somewhere. Our stories, whether we like it or not, have an agenda. And there's really nothing wrong with that. For all of us, this year will bring about yet another cycle of stories that we'll tell to help us make meaning about where we've been, where we are, and where we're going. Those cycles happen so quickly. But I hope it's also a year where we think deeply about those stories and how they serve us in moments of transition and transformation. Maybe you've noticed, but we are on the precipice of one hell of a year. I see people personally wrestling with misinformation and delusion and separation, all while navigating the ways in which systems of power and oppression continue to reinvent themselves and assert themselves in our lives. Later on in the Parable series by Octavia Butler, I would say another of our canon books, in the book Parable of the Talents, which is the second book, you don't often read the second book, but I highly recommend it. Lauren Olamina, the main character, gives us a little more context to why she created Earthseed, her sacred text. If you haven't read it, times such as these, it's literally written in this year, and she writes a sacred text, a creation story, stories about how they got there and where they're going. So in the second book, she gives us a little bit of context about what she was thinking when she wrote that. She said, I wanted to give us a focus, a goal, something big enough, complex enough, difficult enough, and in the end, radical enough to make us become more than we have ever been. We keep falling into the same ditches, you know. I mean, we learn more and more about the physical universe, more about our own bodies, more technology, but somehow, down through history, we go on building empires of one kind or another, and then destroying them in one kind or in one way or another. We go on having stupid wars that we justify and get passionate about, but in the end, all they do is kill huge numbers of people, maim others, impoverish still more, spread disease and hunger, and set the stage for the next war. She's a little bit more that I think it's important for us to hear. She says, but we can choose. We can choose to go on building and destroying until we either destroy ourselves or destroy the ability of our world to sustain us, or we can make something more of ourselves. We can grow up. We can leave the nest. We can fulfill the destiny, make home for ourselves among the stars, and become some combination of what we want to become and whatever our new environments challenge us to become. If I could paraphrase her words, I would say that she's telling us that we get to choose. We get to choose the stories that shape who we become, the stories that impact us, that show us that we are still learning about the impacts of our actions for the world around us. And in many cases, these stories, they dictate how we do business. I was on some tangent and I came across this business expert. How useful are they? In a sermon, but Bob Berg actually had something to say. He says that we do business with people we know, like, and trust, and we get to choose. This year is asking that we do some serious business. Already this year, it's asking that we move with clarity. Already this year is asking that we wrestle with the stories that we have ordered our lives on. Already this year is asking that we take the time it takes to build deep connections because our survival demands it. Already this year is asking if the stories we tell ourselves are serving us and moving us towards liberation or keeping us separate and delusional. Already this year is asking us that we find the stories that compel us to honor our agency, sustain our faith, and most importantly, perhaps, to act. We can use stories as cartographers or map makers, highlighting both where we've been and where we're going. Oh my gosh, you all, there is this fierce map making project by the Association for Women's Rights in Development and the Fearless Collective. That doesn't really mean anything to me, but this map is incredible. I find myself returning to it over and over again. In the foreword, they talk about the practice of map making. The author says that she would watch her mother making maps in the dead of the night. She saw a woman who could make a world. The foreword goes on to talk about how maps have been like stories, created to do harm, drawing imagined borders, reforming nations, stealing land. And sometimes, can you imagine, maps can't even get us where we need to go? You ever put in a destination on Google Maps and it says, no route? Those kinds of maps often were formed with the idea that colonists were finding their way through, quote, empty lands, with the false imagination that these places were uninhabited, that one could walk in a straight line from here to there, conquering any geographical feature or person or animal in the way. But the author points us towards another map-making tradition. She writes this: song lines or dreaming tracks are central to the beliefs of Indigenous Australian nations. These songs, which trace ancestral paths across the land and sky, mark the roots followed by creator beings during the dream time. The song lines are recorded in traditional songs, stories, and dances and paintings of Indigenous communities. The Indigenous people have now inherited these oral maps from their ancestors that help them navigate their land by repeating songs which describe locations of particular landmarks and sacred sites. By singing their songs in sequence, Indigenous people are able to navigate vast distances. Y'all, I am afraid we have some vast distances to navigate. I'm learning more and more about the importance of mantras in this moment. Do you all have mantras that have been getting you through these days? One of them that I picked up last year was that, well, it was after I had, quite frankly, overloaded myself in commitments and things to do and responsibilities. And I said, Sara, and I heard my mother's voice. I said, Sara, you're going to have to make some decisions. You simply cannot do them all. So my mantra for us today is, in part, we're going to have to make some decisions about when and what stories we choose and revisiting them. Catherine May wrote this book, Wintering. I think it should be in our canon. As long as we're building a canon, I feel like it should be in it. And it talks about those moments that call us to stillness and quiet, call us to attention, perhaps. She talks about being involuntary, talks about it being lonely and painful. But I think, although I think she's right, I think we have agency in conjunction with the season of wintering, where we get to choose. I'm watching the time, but you good? Okay, great. Okay. We're going to have to make some decisions about what is true. In a couple years ago, last summer, 2 summers ago, we used to have this value that was languaged as that we have a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. Y'all remember that? Sure. Yeah, of course, right, in our pinky toe, hopefully. I'm not sure we talked about what that looks like enough, though. I've seen it being used as an anything goes slogan. Oh, I'm just on a search for truth and meaning. I've seen it being used to prevent many collective conversations about what we're learning about truth. But in some ways, I think we get it right. You know, part of the Article 2 thing in our bylaws was that every 15 years we get to revisit the stories that we tell about what we believe. That is actually quite radical. I don't think I know anybody that does that. So in June, we voted to sort of ratify our new set of values. And it's not a one-to-one replacement, but instead of the free and responsible search for truth and meaning, we have this word pluralism. Now, to be honest, I am still trying these on. And to say the word pluralism in this moment, ooh, scary, risky. I do know that there's something that feels more possible, or perhaps new questions that emerge when I reflect on the word pluralism. And that question is, can the story about myself and the story about others exist at the same time? I think the answer, honestly, is sometimes yes and sometimes no. But really, the heart of that question, I found a sentiment that's worth exploring. For me, I've been trying this on. It's a wondering. I wonder, but if it is not complex, then it is not the truth. That is no light sentiment. We're going to have to make some decisions. Liz Lerman is a dance artist that I draw frequently on for meaning making in a group in response to art. I think of worship as art. I think of church as art. So for me, it's just a little hop, skip over. It's a series of questions that an artist or a community can have in response with an audience or a congregation. The first one is for the audience or the congregation to share statements of meaning. What helped you feel seen? What helped you connect in this moment? Hearing these sort of help us put together a collective story of what we're doing here that conveys a collective meaning. The second and third are more portions, are more dialogue between the creators and the audience, or however you want to call it. The second question is that the audience shares a neutral question to the artist or the maker from a place of curiosity. You ever notice how hard it is to form a neutral question? It's quite the art. The third question is questions from the creator, the maker, to the audience about decisions that they made that they still have questions about. I chose this. How did that land? I did this. This is the action that I took. How did you receive that? And what I love is that throughout that dialogue, it encourages not only sharing, but nuance and complexity and clarity. It's a process that engages and encourages us to collectively search for truth and meaning, which will always be complex, which will always be worth revisiting, which will always be holy in its becoming. And the last question I like to ask, just sort of as a safety measure, is who would I be without telling this story? For me, this question sort of weeds out the stories that I'm still telling with the underlying desire to perform. Perform goodness, perform anger, perform. It's still worth asking whether I hold on to this story to justify my bitterness or my distrust or my anxiousness. Am I still telling this story so that I don't have to forgive or I don't have to make decisions? When we are clear about our stories being exercises in making the impossible possible, we can tell stories that make maps that get us to the world we, as you use, most often call beloved community. The map-making forward ends with this. Drawing from this tradition, which traces into our geographies, uses poetry as a form of navigation and invokes collective dreaming and memory, intimately connecting people to their landscapes and carriers of those stories. In our atlas, we started to sing. May it be, amen and ashe.